Good morning, everybody. Mr. O again. Try not to be quite so long-winded today, but we're going to go over some state building in Africa. Um, Something we didn't spend a ton of time on, though we did spend some. Again, we're talking 1200 to 1450 for Africa. All right, so Bantu migration. Not a huge concept that we need to worry too much about, but you do need to know about the spread of language here. Basically, went from 500 CE to 1500 CE. The Bantu migrated across Africa, basically southern Saharan Africa, spreading south and east, as you can see in the arrows. The big thing from the Bantus are the spread of language. Most of the sub-Saharan Africa speaks a derivation of Bantu language. It is the root language of most of southern Africa. They also spread agriculture. Now, they weren't agriculturalists themselves, but they picked it up as they went along and spread it along. The same with ironworking and pottery techniques. Okay, syncretism is a big deal in Africa because Christianity and Islam both spread into Africa. Christianity very early on, and then Islam gradually through the trade routes. Local traditions were often adopted and syncretism occurred, and most of what I could find about the examples would have been the lax enforcement of the rules of dress, and a lot of this had to do in Islam, was where most of the syncretism took place, where they blended local tradition with Islam. Lax enforcement of the rules of dress, and a lot of more lax rules with the interactions between men and women. So much so that when Ibn Battuta, the great Muslim traveler, visited parts of Africa, he was appalled with how much time men and women spent together without chaperones, and the lack of what he felt was acceptable attire. All right. Dominant religion in Africa, you can see it's mostly in the north is Islam, with the exception of Somalia. Islam has made some inroads into Nigeria. The southern part of Africa is mostly is predominantly Christianity, but there's a lot of Islam also throughout the southern parts of Africa as well. All right, some kingdoms that we need to remember here. Okay, you have the West African kingdoms of Ghana and Mali. Both are in roughly the same place, and they kind of succeeded each other, so there's a lot of similarity. Both thrived on the gold and salt trade. Both were very wealthy, and both were major players in the slave trade. Ghana, it's more the slave trade into North Africa, Mediterranean, and Middle East. Mali will eventually get involved in the Atlantic slave trade until the empire collapses. Some other things with Mali is they monopolized the trade in horses, which made them very wealthy. And Mansa Musa, who was a Muslim, he was thought to be the richest man in history, and he made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca, where he appeared in many parts of Egypt and all other sources in Southwest Asia, and became very famous for it. On the eastern side of Africa, and most of these were coastal except for Zimbabwe and Ethiopia and Axum. Zimbabwe, also known as Great Zimbabwe, was built on the gold trade from the interior. They also made a lot of money and did very well with cattle herding. And their big claim to fame is that they constructed a huge stone enclosure that was made without mortar. I had that in the opening slide. And it really created an imposing symbol of power to the surrounding communities, which built on their ability to control them. Ethiopia and Axum are a little farther north up along the Nile. They were early Christian kingdoms. Ethiopia, one of the earliest adopters of Christianity, and they featured strongly in the Indian Ocean trade along with the Swahili city-states. The other big piece here is gender relations. Generally, the genders stayed kind of separate in some cases. Rulers' descent was, the men were the rulers. and they descended through the male line, so men generally had most of the political power, and women were often portrayed as dangerous to men because they could seduce them into doing their things. And that was more at the upper levels. Ordinary women are really central to economic life in Africa at that time and even today. Very heavily involved in agriculture and the weaving of cloth. And it was really, the gender roles were really complementary to each other rather than hierarchical, where each kind of maybe similar to the general gender parallelism of the Inca and Aztec, though not quite as strict. Slavery plays a big role in Africa, both in the time period we're looking on and later on. There are three basic forms of slavery that have developed over time. You have the chattel slavery, which is the more traditional form that when we think of slavery, we think of where the slave is the property of the owner. And the children of slaves, if you're born a slave, you stay a slave until your master decides to free you. It is eventually formally abolished in the 19th century. Domestic side of slavery was mostly people that were slaves as servants or often concubines, which often translated them to being sex slaves. It kind of a nasty business there. And then there was debt bondage, which will eventually show up in the later days as indentured servitude. And this is where a person pledges himself or herself against a loan, and if they can't pay the loan back, then they become a slave of the person they took the loan from. There were usually services required that you worked for this person to work off the debt. Oftentimes the duration of doing this was undefined. And it could be passed on to your children if the debt was not paid. And it is really the most widespread form of slavery that exists in the world today. The Zanj Rebellion was basically an uprising in the Abbasid Caliphate of African slaves who had been taken captive and brought to modern-day Iraq. There is over 500,000 people killed by most of the reports I was able to find on this, and that's a combination both of the African slaves and also citizens of the Abbasid Caliphate. It severely disrupted economic activity, as you can imagine. It led to widespread destruction, and it really required a large-scale army, not arm, to put down. Cultural life is really one of the big features here in sub-Saharan Africa, and many of these cultural features remain into today. Three biggies: visual arts, the griots and griots, and music. So visual arts were really used, common use of the human figure, as you can see on the background here. There's a heavy preference for sculptural works. Art was often performed wearing masks, as you see behind you, were incorporated into a dance, and often visually abstract were the exaggerated body parts, whether they made the head bigger or certain other parts in the sculpture. The griots and griots, I believe that's male and female, they're West African storyteller, historian, poet, singer, musician, and they're really the repositories of the oral tradition because there isn't a long tradition of written language in Africa. And the person often became a leader or an advisor to the ruler. And then there's music, very diverse in Africa. Diverse is the population. In some areas, it's a very rhythmic, drum-based music. In other cases, it's polyrhythmic with multiple rhythms coming from different instruments. And it's really an influence into many modern musical traditions. Jazz, rap, R&B, salsa, reggae, and a lot of others have their roots in African musical tradition. Okay, that's what you need for Africa. Next up will be Europe.